Hi, I'm recording a review of this book, Pictures on a Page. Let me see if I can zoom out a bit. Yeah, there we go. Pictures on a Page, which I've drawn and which you can watch me draw over here on the right, because I hope it might be slightly more interesting and exciting if I don't just stare at the camera all the time. So I'm going to zoom back in a little bit and put myself over here. No, that doesn't work. Wow, very confusing. So, okay, so I'm going to go over here. Right, and the drawing is going to appear on the right. That's me drawing this book cover, which I started to do last week, I think. The back of the book, I've got a lot of text on it, and it's all about how Harold Evans, who was the editor of the Times, recommended that a person might use photographs on the page of a book. Of a newspaper, because he was a newspaper editor. So that it's full of, hang on, I'm going to zoom out again on this one. And maybe I can make this picture a bit bigger. Hello. So it's full of pictures of, well, it's got a preface, but it's got a load of great classic pictures. There's a kind of horrible one there, so I won't show you that one, but I'll show you this one. Well, actually, they're both horrible, pretty horrible pictures where someone just happened to be being shot at that moment. This is a news man who's doing this selection. You see the pictures are all basically all black and white, because at the time the book was published these pictures were black and white. But the reason why I wanted to do a live stream, pictures in newspapers were all black and white. The reason I wanted to do the live stream, because I think this book is just incredibly relevant. So there's Sir Roger Bannister, who broke the 4-minute mile record, and more of him doing it there. And the point is not just to show you some great classic photographs, but to give a sense of what the book does and how it breaks down the task of, let's see if I can move myself out of the way of the drawing. Yeah, that's better. How it breaks down the ways in which you might always think about using pictures, whether or not you're doing them on in a newspaper, because obviously most people are not doing it in a newspaper. Oh, I'm looking at the wrong camera now. Hang on, which camera am I meant to be looking at? Yeah, I'm going to try and... now that is confusing. If I zoom out a bit, then you can see me there. And yeah, that works, I think. Hello. Right, so what does it cover and why is it important? Because if Harold Evans was a great journalist, which generally most people think means a words person, what's he got to say about how you do pictures, and why should a picture person care about that? Well, as it says on the cover of this book, there's a quote by Helmut Newton, the great photographer. "I've always treasured pictures on a page. It is a fascinating work," says Helmut Newton. And I'm just going to turn off my notifications. How do I do that? I have to do it here for a moment. Do not disturb. Okay. Here I am again. So when this copy that I've got, the revised edition, was printed 20 years after it first came out. And it's kind of laughable, this, but it says, because that's 20 years after the book first came out, is already as long ago as so my edition is 1997. So it first came out in 1978. So this is another of the books from the 70s, which I suppose I'm sharing because when I came into journalism roughly 20 and a bit years ago, these were the standard books. Now, I'm not saying that they should still be, and I'm not saying that they are. Maybe they're not. Maybe they could be, but there's something incredibly powerful about looking at something that's a little bit past it and seeing what makes it still valuable, if anything, what makes it still valuable. And what have we learned? What have we learned, and what can we do better or differently now? It's a shame so many of the pictures in here are so distressing, but they are actually quite distressing. Here's one of the less distressing pictures. It's Lenin when he was really starting to be no longer really able to cope properly after his stroke. So there are all these sort of tremendously powerful news photographs. And then he talks about things like the symbolism. This photograph, I remember some years ago, this photograph of boys outside Lord's cricket ground was actually explained in the letters pages of a newspaper. This photograph was used as a symbol of the difference between really privileged posh boys and working class boys. But one of the people actually in the photograph wrote a letter to the, I think it was the Independent newspaper, and actually shed some light on the reality of the picture and what was really, who really was privileged and who wasn't privileged. So it's really interesting as a book to think about, like, what is the function of different pictures? How can you use pictures to crop in on something that's important, or to zoom out and show something differently? How can you make a choice about what you're doing and what you're using? So, for example, here are some pictures of Nehru, the leader of India. I think it's Nehru. I'm pretty sure it was Nehru. Yeah, Nehru. So there are three misses. He calls this the three photos that missed. And then the one that was used is Nehru sniffing a rose, and that went onto the cover of the picture post. So he talks about how to make a selection from a set of photos. He talks about the different ways in which to cut in on them. So this picture here, hang on, where is it? Sorry. Oh yeah, this is a beautiful one of a moment frozen in time just before any of them hit the water, and then the one below where someone's just floating. Got case histories from photographers talking about how they might make a choice for a shot. The weird ways in which we can distort what we see. Here's a fireman up a ladder, but because of the way the photograph's been taken, the fireman looks like he's way bigger than everyone else in the picture. Only a perspective thing, but it startles and it stands out, and you can imagine that if you saw that in a newspaper, it would make you look twice. And with, at the time I'm recording this, TikTok works by grabbing people's attention. If you lose people's attention in half a second, TikTok stops showing your thing to other people. So this idea about having to be arresting and grab someone and make them think and stop and pause and keep watching still applies, even though Harold Evans is using black and white photos and talking about them for a newspaper. It's really exactly the same thing. How can you grab and hold attention? And so I think the book's really valuable for, buy a second-hand copy or something, or get it from the library. The case studies of how someone captured the face of a hooligan. So this photographer at the top went on a shoot. It's got all of these crowd scenes of trouble with violence on the pavement, and then he's got this one close-up shot of someone. And so talking about how you get that picture, how you make the selection, I think that's endlessly fascinating. I'm going to just jump ahead a little bit with some of these things, because the downside of also saying, this applies to TikTok, the downside of saying that is that actually nowadays kind of everyone is their own photo editor. Everyone knows a lot of this stuff already. So I think what's really exciting about this is seeing how you can take something that is, as it were, past it and old news and not important, and you can reenact it, you can restage it, you can find a way to make it new, make it work again. So let me just jump ahead, and I'll give you a quick overview of what the chapter titles are, because I think that's pretty useful. Meanwhile, over on the right of the screen, what you can see is my drawing of the cover coming along a bit, I think. And that is the outline of this thing, because I was drawing this book. And that woman on the cover of the book is actually Ethel Kennedy, the wife of Robert Kennedy, at the time that he was fatally shot. And I guess that's an example of how pictures can become something that was so sensational at that moment when it was taken, can become a bit like, who is that and what's that about and why has that woman got her hand up? Who cares? Who knows who Ethel Kennedy was? And that's the great mystery of journalism, is how to be really, really fascinating in the moment and then to sustain that interest over time. And I think there's probably a fairly close correlation between how fascinating something is at the time, really, really top front page news, and how quickly it loses interest. Often, not always, because let's say late this year, we lost Queen Elizabeth II after the longest reign ever. So the day in which her death was on the front page of the newspapers is going to remain newsworthy for a very long time. But broadly speaking, whatever's on the front of today's newspaper, I doubt that people will really remember it. So I won't try and look through every bit of this, because I don't know how interesting that would be. But what I can do is read to you the contents page and give you a sense of what's actually in this book. So what makes Chapter 1, the unbeatable news photograph? What makes something the unbeatable one? And then thinking about going on an assignment in Chapter 2, 3 tests that Evans used for selecting a picture. Then he looks at things like action in a photograph, the composition of the photograph. Chapter 6 is the decisive moment. Chapter 7 is the minutiae of time and space. So how can you go really, really close in on something, and how can... Let's have a look. There's a really good one I can hear about that. Chapter 7, page 127. So not only about choosing the specific time, but also how do you look at the close-up or the wide angle. Yeah, look, here's one. He takes this example of several moments of Hitler at the time of the French surrender. So Hitler's obviously quite triumphant. Look at all those pictures. They've all been shot in rapid succession. And the one that you might want to go for, I suppose not if you're a German newspaper, but makes Hitler look very triumphant and perhaps a bit silly. So thinking about how does your selection of a photograph have an impact on the editorial effect of what you're doing? What would make it more powerful and do the thing that you want it to do? Sometimes also there's like what actually is acceptable. So he's got a picture of there used to be lots of these people who would run onto football pitches naked, and the policeman puts his helmet over the private parts to preserve everyone's modesty, and well, that's the idea. So it kind of makes a funny picture that won't offend everybody that's in the paper. So jumping it back a bit, let's go back to the chapter headlines. So looking at people, looking at the sense of sequence, looking at picture editing and creative cropping. I'll go into creative cropping because that's a perennially interesting. Actually, there's one of the people is really good. 149. There's a really lovely picture in the section on people. Come on, it's got to be in this section. I'm sure it was. No, not Einstein. Not that. Oh yeah, what I was saying about reenacting something that might have seemed like who cares, but the painter Francis Bacon, who's recently had a retrospective exhibition, the late painter, the dead painter Francis Bacon. Here's a photograph of Bacon on Primrose Hill. Well, I know that path very well, and although I dare say the trees may have changed a little bit because they'll have grown or been chopped down, I could reenact that photo now. I could go there and sort of think, what could I do with that picture of Francis Bacon and turn it into something of my own. That's why I think this kind of archival material is so fascinating. So, creative cropping, page 203. Actually, I mean, he's got creative cropping all over the place. Not just creative, but kind of how to make the pictures more useful. There's a fairly wide shot of President Nixon with President Khrushchev of Russia, and he suggests how you would crop in to remove all the unnecessary waste and to make it a much more intimate photograph. So that's not even in the chapter on cropping, that's editing for story content. The debate on capitalism versus communism between Khrushchev and Vice President Nixon. The top is a waste, the bottom has white intrusion, but it's essential to retain the two soap packets, washing machine, and the sense of a fascinated crowd. So that's what he's done there. He's kept in the soap packets, kept in the crowd, but he's lost all that stuff around the top. And he's gone much closer in on Khrushchev. You see how my iPhone is trying to recognise their faces with those yellow squares, yellow frames around them. And then looking at how you can maximise the intimacy and the power, the sort of the vigour of a photograph. So here is a photograph on the bottom, which I think you can just about see. It's quite. I can't see it, but that's quite distant effect. But what happens if you crop in, cutting out the top and the bottom? See there, the top and the bottom make the two crowds look rather distant from each other. But here, they look so much more tightly close together, much more sense of violent potential in that image, in that encounter between the police and the people who were at the Notting Hill Carnival, where I grew up, as it happens, but I wasn't one of those people. This is the picture that I love most of all in this book. It's a really wonderful image of the American President Eisenhower and Helen Keller, who was blind and deaf, and therefore had to make sense of everything with her hands. So she's meeting the American president, right? And then she wants to kind of, again, there's a bit of cropping to get much closer. There's her meeting with the president, which is funny enough as it is, even there with there's Helen Keller putting her hands on his face to try to sort of get to know him. And then this is how Evans recommends cutting, much closer. So you lose the hands under her elbow, you go much closer in on them. It's a much more intimate photo. I just think that's brilliant, really exciting. Now, I've got a few more minutes before this cover picture over there is being finished. Then a clever bit of cropping here. At Conservative, I need to go in a bit closer. You can look at that picture of the thing. At Conservative Party conference, you can see various people on the stage. It's a fairly wide shot. It's not very exciting, but what an amazing effect you can get if you go in close to these two here. You can make them look really fed up with each other, which they probably were. But you see the difference between that wide shot and then going in closer. That's just brilliant. That's Enoch Powell and Ted Heath. I'm not sure if Heath was at that time the Prime Minister, but he was at some point. Right, now more cropping pictures, please. Yeah, here's a picture of Franklin Roosevelt. Sorry, go back over here. not that one. There's Roosevelt in his carriage, and it looks kind of okay. But look how much more you can focus on his expression and his seeming pleased with himself by just going in on him. So choosing to leave out much of that picture, get rid of the other person, and just that. So Harold Evans, talking as a writer, as a sort of journalist of words, but also someone who edited a paper and needed to be right on top of the way in which the whole thing was put together, showing you all of these techniques and well, I think it's probably fairly obvious by now that I think this is pretty good, this book. It's got a section here about captions. And I think that's quite interesting because if we are, as has already been noted, we are in the time of TikTok. We're also at a time of very different social attitudes than the mid-70s when Evans published this. So it's already going to leap out as soon as I say the first thing I can see here. But he's written a long section about how to write captions. And while it's going to be kind of interesting to think about how out of date some of the words are, it's also probably quite interesting to think about what we can take from it and use and ignore the stuff that we don't like. So at the very beginning of this section on captions and how to use them, he mentions a very well-known proprietor of newspapers back in the day. Lord Northcliffe, surveying a dull page, told them to put a pretty girl picture in it, according to his biographer. They brought him a selection, but the first he picked up had no name on it. "Who is it?" asked Lord Northcliffe. Nobody knew. "Put it in," he said, under the caption, "Who is it?" Many captions are hardly any more informative. Many might be classified as "you don't say" captions, in other words, statements of the obvious. Beneath a photograph of President Carter speaking, the caption sometimes says, "President Carter speaking." Beneath a picture of the Prime Minister entering a car, it says, "The Prime Minister enters his car." There was a publicity picture of a man wearing an Apollo spacesuit standing in the street talking to a London policeman. The man in the suit had all the gear: visor, space helmet, dials, white suit, heavy boots, gloves. The caption said, "The spacesuit poses a sharp contrast with the policeman's uniform." The tendency of caption writers to treat readers as morons is easily corrected by an editor striking his employee a hard blow on the head twice with a blunt instrument. When he comes round, he should be reminded, notice the he should be reminded of the what, where, when, why questions the picture raises. What was President Carter speaking about? Why was he apparently happy? Where was the Prime Minister going? What is the man in the spacesuit up to? The writer doesn't need to answer every one of the who, what, why, where questions, certainly not when the story accompanying a picture and the hope is that the picture will just draw the reader into the text. But one little extra fact will do. So here's an example. An actor's car broke down at his wedding and there was a comic story about his rescue with a photograph of a powerful car being pushed to make it start. In several papers it had this rather boring one. That's not Harold Evans' words, that's me. Friends pushed the groom's car after it broke down. I will not punish the reader by recording the common headline. What can be done with the caption? The point of the picture is that a glamorous car has gone embarrassingly on the blink. It's hard to write that in a caption without visual verbal duplication or irrelevance. But with one factual snippet, it can be done. The groom and 150 sleeping horses. Well, that don't really work anymore because nobody remembers that horsepower is a thing that cars have. So that's a really bad example. Name captions, he says. They're too straightforward and bald. A name plus a quote is one of the most useful nudges and often takes just as little space. Mr. Lee, quote, "It's fantastic." Time and Newsweek magazines appreciate the baiting power of a caption with their famous teasers. Moshe Dayan, how to crash a party. Yeah, anyway, okay, maybe some of this is actually dated a bit, because you need to know who Moshe Dayan is, and you need to know who President Carter is. I think you need to be a bit of an insider on that one. So this is meant to be 5-star reviews, and I'll give the book a 5-star review somehow, but this is just me talking basically to myself and anyone who is eager enough to watch hello you, as I think about what am I going to write. It goes on about various other bits, including crediting the photographer and that kind. Yeah, that'll do for now, I think. Haven't quite finished this replay, so what am I going to do? I'm going to just jump ahead so you can see how I finished this picture. If I move myself off to the side a bit, but there's me underneath, that's when I was drawing it. And yep, the picture's coming along, I would say. Oh, that's it. Okay, that's the end of this live stream. Thank you for watching, if you've watched, which I see you have. Bye.